going to take you through the wetland and ask the question, what is a native species? Well, the short answer is a native species is any plant or animal that lives in a place where it has been historically found. So if we say that a species is native to Florida, that means that the plant or animal occurs here naturally. Can you think of any species native to Florida? How about the West Indian manatee? You may have spotted these along the coast or in estuaries, or during the winter, you may have seen one in Florida's freshwater springs, where they go to warm up as temperatures drop. Or how about a sea turtle? Sea turtle species like the loggerhead or green migrate through the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, but they are considered native to Florida. Or how about animals that you may see in your backyard, like the raccoon? Another species you may have thought of is the American alligator. This species was not introduced or brought to Florida by humans. It occurs naturally in our state, meaning it is a native species and a regular you can spot at your local wetland. Native species can occupy the land and the water, and even the sky. Take this snail kite, for example. Snail kite primarily feed on large snails, specifically apple snails. While there is a species of apple snail native to Florida, another species known as the giant apple snail has been introduced to our state from South America. The giant apple snail is an example of a non-native species. A non-native species is one that has been introduced to a new place outside of its known historic range. So we are going to look at some apple snail shells that I've collected here. And these are called the giant apple snail. They're from South America, and they're introduced in the state of Florida and a couple of other places in the southeast United States. And they get their name because, as you can see, they get pretty giant. Another way that you can tell this is a non-native species is by the coil of its shell. You can see here, there is a little indentation. So that's how we can tell it from a native apple snail. When non-native species arrive in a new area, they can sometimes affect the ecosystem and disrupt food webs. Giant apple snails have become part of the food web in Florida's natural areas. The non-native species is now an important part of the diet of wetland birds like the snail kites we saw earlier and other birds like limpkins. The giant apple snail also impacts the native Florida apple snail, as the two species compete for food and space. All of the effects of the giant apple snail on native species are not yet known, but the introduction of the giant apple snail has certainly led to a new food source for native birds like the snail kite. You can see here, the snail kites find a giant apple snail for lunch, although they drop this one. Not all non-native species are animals, though. Many plants can also be non-native if they're introduced to a new area. You may even see some of these plants every day and not realize they aren't native to Florida. Some of the plants are often so pretty, it's easy to assume that they're part of the local ecosystem. When we zoom into our wetland landscape, we see a plant with purple flowers. It also has hollow, tube-like stalks, which help it to float on top of the water, just like a raft in a pool. As eye-catching as it is, this plant is a non-native species known as the water hyacinth. Floating helps the water hyacinth spread across the surface as water moves. As you can see, this plant can spread far and wide. It can quickly transform the entire landscape and become the dominant plant in the water. Sometimes non-native species can establish reproducing populations and cause harm to the ecosystem they have been introduced to. We call these species invasive species. Can you think of an invasive species here in Florida? One common non-native species that is now considered invasive is the Burmese python. These large snakes are native to Asia, but were found in the Florida Everglades in the 1990s. Though we can't say for certain how they were introduced, one theory is that pet owners released their snakes once they grew too large. Once the pythons established a population, they began to feed on native species, including small mammals like rabbits, which has affected populations of native species in South Florida. We consider Burmese pythons to be invasive because they have caused damage to the important Everglades ecosystem. USGS scientists work hard to track down these problematic pythons and help our partners develop methods to control their spread. However, We can't be in the field all day, every day, looking for non-native and invasive species, so we rely on the public and our partners to help us monitor the presence and spread of these plants and animals of concern. The USGS Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species, or NAS, database collects reported sightings of non-native aquatic plants and animal species across the U.S. and in U.S. territories, like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We provide this information to stakeholders, like land resource managers, so they know what non-native species might be in their area. We can also use this data to help predict where non-native species might spread in the future. This tool isn't just for scientists and environmental managers. You can use this tool too. Start by looking up non-native aquatic species that have been reported in your neighborhood and learn about each one of those species via the profiles we have created. Let's check out the giant apple snail. Using the NAS database is pretty easy. First, we go to nas.er.usgs.gov. Here you can see the main screen, and we have a lot of menu options. We're going to go to Database and Queries, and then in order to view a species profile, we're going to choose the text-based search. Here you can type in the name of the species that you want to learn more about. We're going to type in giant apple snail. Comes up for us, and we're going to hit Submit. Now over here you can see species profile. We're going to click that, and we've arrived at the species profile. Species profiles are a collection of information about a species in the NAS database. You have a photo to show you what the species looks like, and if you move down, you can see that there's a lot of information. The native range of a species, we see for the apple snail, as we learned earlier, is in South America. And if we go down a little more, we can see where the non-native range of the species is as well. Here, highlighted in red, you can see where the species occurs in the United States. Here's a table also showing where the species occurs in the United States and territories. If we move further down, we can learn about the ecology of the species. For example, the apple snail likes to live in freshwater lakes, rivers, streams, and ponds. It was introduced from aquariums, and here we can learn about the impacts of the apple snails. They're known to be agricultural pests feeding on rice crops. They carry a parasite called the rat lungworm, and we can also see that a predator of the apple snail is the snail kite, which we learned about earlier. And since the snail kite has been feeding on the apple snails in Florida, the bill size of the snail kite has grown in response to the larger than normal prey size when compared to the native apple snail. That's a very interesting thing to learn about native and non-native species living together and how they interact. Down here you can learn even more and find references if you want to read more about the research that's done. Now let's check out the water hyacinth. We're going to go back to the database and queries. We'll do a text-based search, and we're going to type in water hyacinth. Okay, a few options come up for us. The one that we want is the floating water hyacinth. So we're going to choose that, and we're going to hit Submit. Okay, and here are our options. We're going to select Species Profile, and here we see the plant that we found in the wetland. In the photo here, you can see the familiar inflated stalks that help the plant to float. Now let's scroll down and learn about where the species comes from. It is from South America, just like the apple snail we learned about earlier. And as we can see, its non-native range in the United States is red, and it is pretty extensive through the U.S. and the U.S. territories. And here's the table showing more information about where it's located in its non-native range. Further down, we can learn about the impacts of the species, and it appears that it interferes with navigation. This is because it grows in dense floating mats, like we saw in the wetland, and that clogs up areas where boats need to get through. So waterways that were once free of vegetation now become large mats of vegetation, and so that really changes the ecosystem, and it really affects boat navigation. And here are some references if you want to learn more about the research that's done. Another way that you can use the NASS database is to report a non-native species sighting yourself. So if you see a non-native species and you want to report it to NASS, go to nas.er.usgs.gov, click on Report a Sighting. This is a Privacy Act statement that is letting you know that the information that you give to USGS will be used by us. Filling out the sighting report form is pretty easy and takes just a couple of minutes. The first thing that you can do is put the name of your species, the kind of animal or plant that it is, and the number that you see. You show us the date that you found the animal and the state that you were in, and if you know it, the county. There's also a helpful map where you can show the USGS scientists exactly where you found a species. And if you click it here, it fills out the coordinates above. You can also be more specific and give text information about where you found the species. And below here is information about you. If you would like to provide your email and your name, we can let you know more about your sighting. And then you upload files here to show photos of the animal or plant that you saw. And then you submit your report. But we can't do this without the help of you and other citizen scientists. If you are walking around your neighborhood and happen to spot a non-native species, you can report the sighting to us directly. We receive data from naturalist apps that you can download on a tablet or phone. Just remember to keep your eyes peeled. Some of the non-native species might not be so obvious. To learn more about non-native species in Florida and across the nation, and to report non-native species sightings, please visit nas.er.usgs.gov.